Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Where's the Line? I'm Sabrina, and I'm here with my other co-host, Jane. Jane, how are you doing?
Hello, I am doing well. It's been very busy last couple weeks. As you know, we are thinking of doing a kitchen renovation. So that's going to happen very soon. We've been looking at cabinets, we've been looking at backsplash, appliances, very adult things. And we're talking to contractors. The plan is to make a decision in the next week. It's going to be quite pricey, so we're
Exciting.
hoping that it's a good investment. But yeah, things are kind of busy in life. What about you?
Well, there's a reason for me to visit Chicago and see your kitchen,
Yes.
besides seeing you, obviously. Yeah, no, that's really cool. Keep me posted on that. I want to see some pictures.
Yeah.
Yep, I'm doing well and soaking up every last day of summer. I am watching a puppy also who is keeping me busy and apologize in advance if they will be barking today's episode, but we'll do
Oh,
our
he's
best.
very
And
cute.
he is very cute. That is true.
He's
So
very cute,
puppy
but
eyes
he is
definitely,
young.
yeah. They're like irresistible sometimes. He does something bad and then he just looks me in the eye and it's just can't resist. So yeah, I feel for all the parents out there and the puppy parents. I'm definitely learning a lot.
It's real. It's real. A real learning moment for you.
It is. It is.
Well, Sabrina, we are running solo, just the two of us today, which is very exciting because this topic is something that I've been working on, and I have a lot of insecurity around this. I know this is something you've worked on for a while now, and so you're probably a lot further in this journey than I am. But we're talking about how to not feel lonely even if you are alone. Obviously this manifests in so many ways. It can, show up in your relationship. It could manifest in your relationship with your family or even like the friends around us, right? So I'm super pumped because I know there's a lot to talk about today, and I'm really excited to have this conversation, just the two of us. But before we get started, Sabrina, how about you help us define what is the difference between being alone versus being lonely? Because I think there's a pretty big difference there.
Yeah, absolutely. Great context. So this is a topic that's very much near and dear to my heart. And I think so people can be alone, but still feel really happy and feel contentment and satisfaction, right?
Hmm.
However, you can also be lonely. You can feel lonely and be in a relationship. So you can be in a relationship but feel lonely.
Hmm.
And you can be surrounded by people and still feel lonely. So the being alone and happy compared to feeling lonely is really feeling lonely is someone that or is a situation where you sort of lack that satisfaction and you lack that contentment. And it's a sad feeling, right? And I think we've all been there.
Hmm.
And I mean, there's ways to get out of it, but sort of being alone in itself is actually not a bad thing, right?
Hmm.
Because you can still be really happy. It's more so when you feel lonely, it's just that feeling where that void you somehow
Right.
can't fill.
Emptiness.
Right. And you can still be surrounded by a lot of people. Like physically, you're surrounded by people, but you can still feel lonely because something inside of you is
Right.
missing. And that's the piece that, yeah, that's the one that you can start working on. I've worked on it a lot. It's still work in progress, but really excited to dissect that more and more today.
Yeah, I like that a lot. It sounds like being alone is very much like a physical type of state, right? Like you're literally alone, whereas lonely is like this mental, or like to your point, it's a feeling of emptiness. It's more of a emotional type of state. Um, yeah, I think before we even get into some of the questions and specific topics, why don't we share a little bit more about just like what's our experience of being alone or being lonely? I'm happy to maybe start first. Like I mentioned, this is something I've been wanting to work on, and this is something I've started working on as of the last like year or two with my therapist. I feel like I've just never really been alone, and it's like kind of just naturally had happened. Um, I've always like lived with my family prior to, say, going to college. And then I went to college. I pretty much had roommates every single year, even like the summers that I was living like on campus or going to classes in the summer. So I always had somebody that was like literally pretty much with me all the time.
Mhm.
And then I also was a part of like a sorority on campus. So there's obviously a lot of like women that I can, literally be with. So in college, I was very rarely alone. After college, I moved to Chicago. And I think, like, as I think back, that was also probably one of my loneliest time.
Mm.
But I was also not alone. I had roommates. I was living in Chicago with two roommates in the beginning. And then I met Kyle, who's my partner now. And it's just like, never really had a chance where I was like literally alone. There was 1 year in between where I said, you know what? I need to just live alone. I need to be by myself. And if this person will eventually become my husband, who like ended up actually becoming my husband, I need to at least at some point in my life have this moment of like living alone and have this independence. And so what's been your experience, Sabrina?
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing. And I think you and I, it's interesting because we both feel like have such different stories, but we're hoping that our audience are probably similarly, some fall into that category, some fall into the other one. Yeah, and even for you to take that time to be alone and actually see what that looks like for you, I think is really critical. For me, I've somehow always ended up starting somewhere alone. Somehow that's just been my life. Like when I was 16 years old, I moved to Australia for 3 months in a school exchange. And while obviously I had a host family there, but it was always sort of starting new, not knowing anyone. So that notion of being alone, definitely for me, like many, many times, I moved to Madrid for an internship, completely alone, didn't know anyone, but then met a lot of people. Moved to the UK alone and found people through work and whatever. Moved to Chicago, same thing. But in like, I think being alone again, like starting alone and then just being open to meeting people, and then like figuring out and building that community, to me came like somewhat natural. But even though I was alone at first many times, I think the feeling of loneliness started to creep in like the older I got, because I was questioning my choices a little bit. Like I would start from scratch so many times, and now that I'm in Minneapolis for the first time, I'm like, okay, I'm here now, not getting any younger. I have a good community, but I started to feel more lonely in a sense, which is odd, right? Because you would think, I have a lot of good friends. I may be single, but so long story short, I think that's the whole point about, even though I'm not physically alone, I'm far away from my family, but the older I get, the more I'm experiencing this feeling of loneliness. And I can't really sometimes pinpoint it on why. And it puts you into a certain, I want to say depressed is like a strong word, but it is a state of depression sometimes.
Yeah, it's like sad. It's sadness.
Yeah, it's sadness, right?
Yeah. I 100% agree with you. And what's so interesting between our two stories, and I'll even add a little bit of context too. So when I first moved to America, I think that might have created some PTSD from my fear of being alone. Is like when I first came here, I did not speak the language. And so I was in school, not being able to communicate with anybody, not having friends. And I think at that time, because I was younger, like all you want is to belong. And so because of that, I think it almost created this sense of fear to be alone, to not belong somewhere, to not have friends, to have lunch with, right? Like as simple as that sound, it like means a lot. And so I think since then I've always seeked out people to be with. And earlier I was saying like, oh, I naturally have always been with people. Maybe isn't all that natural. Like maybe I just enjoy living with roommates because I maybe have this fear, right, that I always have. And I think now I'm very much aware of the insecurity that I have of doing anything alone because I'm
Mhm.
worried that people will perceive me a certain way.
Mm.
So that's something that I want to even mention, because as I'm hearing your story, a lot of your experiences of moving to Australia, Madrid, and all these places, like that's very exciting. And while you are alone, like you took that action, like it was a proactive action of moving there. And
Uh,
so maybe it's less like PTSD, right? More of like you have this exciting memory attached to being alone.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
talk to me a little bit more about, because you mentioned like as you get older, you're now starting to feel the sense of like loneliness. Like share with me a little bit more about that particular struggle.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's almost as if I'm reflecting on my life and I am so grateful for all these experiences. And I was chasing this next thing, the next experience. But then as humans, we crave connection, right? And we crave deep connection. And at the end of
Mhm.
the day, you can have as many friends as you want, you can have the greatest family, but we all are we're all drawn to something that is more intimate, more romantic, and having that sharing your life with like a special someone. So I think
Mhm.
now I am in my mid 30s. I'm sort of actually when I turned 30, it started to really start to make me realize, okay, like what do I want to invest in, and am I going to find that person? So
Mhm.
and I think having sort of putting yourself under that pressure of I need to find that one, right? And when you don't have it, that's when that negative voice and that mean voice comes in and is like, well, you're alone. You're not only alone, I shouldn't say you're alone in terms of you don't have a romantic partner. And so that then manifests in this like loneliness feeling. At the end of the day, like life is beautiful when you can share it with someone, and not having that contributes a lot to this, in my case, feeling of loneliness at times.
Right. And earlier you touched on this topic of like sometimes you could be in a relationship, but you might still feel alone. Is that something that you've experienced?
When I think back to those days, I'm finding more gratitude in my current state, because yeah, I'm waiting for that right person, right? And I just remind myself, even if you have someone, doesn't mean you feel less lonely. So
Right.
it's, I think, good for our listeners to also realize, like, you can be, of course you can have, I feel like it's not that hard to find someone, right?
Mm,
But finding a special someone, that's the hard part, or someone that actually adds to your life and someone that you want to really invest in. So I think sometimes when we are in that rut of, oh, I just want to have someone, think back to those days. I'm sure everyone has had that. They were in a maybe not the best relationship. You
right.
might have felt really lonely then. So just
Yeah.
reframing it and bringing it back to, okay, could be different, but also, was I really happier then? That's helped me.
And I'll add too, like, even for me, who has been in a relationship, like, I'm in a stable, happy relationship. There are also components of my relationship where I'm like, yeah, I feel lonelier. I wish my partner knew this side of me more. So, like, for example, I'm Asian American and my partner is white. And so a lot of the experiences that I have as an Asian American living here in the United States, um, like I experience this alone. It's not something that he will maybe ever experience, right? I'll share it with him verbally, but
Mhm.
like I can't really relate to him, and he sometimes may not be able to relate to me purely just because of our upbringing and our background. And so a lot of times we obviously have ongoing conversation about these things, but sometimes I probably will relate to a friend more in that situation than my partner.
Mm.
So to your point, like 100%, like in obviously in tough relationship and difficult bad relationships, you probably feel more lonely even if you're not literally alone. But I think yeah, even in like good relationships, there might be components of your relationship where you maybe can relate to somebody else easier than the
Mm.
partner that you're with.
So, Jane, obviously you and I, we have different stories, right? But still, we may feel lonely in different settings. What are some habits that you're hoping to break in those mental traps when you do feel lonely?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to the previous comment that I had around how people view me when I'm doing something alone. I know for a fact that is something that really holds me back. And maybe, yeah, it goes back to this concept of like framing and trying to reframe something. Because I think, again, growing up, I have always felt like because I was alone and I didn't have friends, or I didn't belong, or I didn't speak the language, whatever it may be, that I was seen as like a loser, right? Like that's just like a common thing that happens in school.
Yeah.
And I think that created this sense of like being alone or being seen in public of doing something alone is a negative thing. The older that I'm getting, the more I'm realizing that that is not the case, clearly, and that that is something I actually need to work on. It's actually an insecurity that I've just always had. Like, it's to the point where I sometimes don't even feel comfortable. I mean, we were talking about this. I don't feel comfortable going to watch a movie by myself. Plenty of people go watch a movie by themselves, right? At least not a big deal. But to me, I've always thought, okay, the movies or like going out to eat is a very social thing. So if I was eating alone, or if I was in the theater alone, then how are people going to perceive me? That's always a big concern. So I'm working on it. But when I was thinking about this question, like that was the immediate thing that I had that I know is wrong, but it's very hard for me to overcome this perception.
Yeah,
What
no,
about
I
you?
think it's interesting how this is ingrained in some of us, right? From, as you said, like school almost, when you sit alone in
Yeah.
the luncheon
Yeah.
in the cafeteria, you were seen as a loser. People were seen as losers. Like, why is this
Right.
person alone? So,
Right.
and that like just is almost this trauma. Trauma is a big word, but it's like ingrained in us.
I don't know why that impacts me so much, but clearly, like when I immigrated here, I like obviously didn't have any friends, couldn't speak the language to make any
Mm.
friends. Like it was very scary.
This is what my therapist actually told me. It's really helpful. Not saying I am lonely, but oh, I'm noticing these voices coming in and they're saying I'm lonely, but am I really? And reframing it in that, like I have a really good friend group here. I am very lucky to have a family that cares for me. I have dear friends in Chicago, like Jane and others. Like I have friends around the world who I can talk to at any time. And also realizing nothing in life is permanent. This is just a stage or a phase, right? I think oftentimes, especially like after a breakup or after, yeah, I think a breakup is a good example where we feel like this is going to last forever, this stage of grief, this stage of severe sadness. But this too shall pass is one of my favorite lines.
I think your point about like everything is not permanent, and obviously you're talking about it more from a sadness or like grief, right? Like you're from breaking up or whatever. But to your point, it also impacts happy couples. And I think this is something that I'm working on too, is like, yeah, I'm in a very happy, stable, like I feel very good in my relationship, but like you never know what's going to happen. And it is so important for you to have your individual life in addition to your partnership life.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
a lot of times, and I think this is, I see this often in a lot of like elderly, even like for my own family, I've seen this with my grandparents, like one partner passes, right? Like that sometimes like that's inevitable. It will happen. The other partner often will like lose themselves.
Yeah.
And it doesn't just happen when you're older, but it happens with like young couples too. Like a lot of my friends, and I'm probably guilty of this too, when I first started dating Kyle, like you no longer have your individual identity because you're so absorbed in this like couples relationship. And I'm now starting to kind of come out of that like in a very healthy way. Like I am very happy with my relationship, but at the same time, I'm now trying to develop more individual relationships as well and foster individual relationships, because that is also important for me to keep my own identity, for me to grow as an individual while I am growing with my partner. So to your point, like nothing lasts. And so it is just as important to foster your relationship with your spouse as it is to build your own like kind of individuality. And part of that is being okay with being alone, being okay with, or like working through being lonely. So it's very much a part of that.
And I just want to acknowledge, I'm very proud of you, because so many couples lose themselves even when they're in a couple, or they just see, they just have an identity together and they do everything together, right? And to each their own, but just for you to see sort of, I'm going to focus on me as well. I'm going to have my me time, or I want to become more comfortable being alone, even though I have a very amazing partner. I think that is so critical, and that's going to set you both up for success in the long run.
Yeah, thank you. I hope so. And I think now I look at even some of my friends who are earlier in their relationships, and you see, right, like they're super, super absorbed in that relationship. It's like a honeymoon phase, and it's super sweet. But I think, like as I'm starting to come out of that phase, I'm learning the importance of keeping our individuality while like, and sometimes honestly, like that helps your relationship too, right? Like, if you're not just stuck together all the time. And like, that's also why this podcast is super exciting for me. Like, it's a hobby that I pursue. He supports me. He knows that I'm doing this. And, I feel supported from my partner, but he does not need to be a part of this thing that I do with just my friend. Like, so I think it's super important. I know we're starting to talk a little bit about like techniques and actual things, right, that we can do, like doing a hobby by yourself, going to do things by yourself. But you obviously have been through this journey much longer than I have. What are some things that have kind of worked for you?
I can say I'm really happy to be single, and it took me a while to say that. Like, yes, I do want a partner, but that right time will come, that right person will come. In the meantime, I'm just going to enjoy the heck out of my life right now. All the things that you can do while you're alone, some of the things you have to give up when you're in a relationship, right? And you have to make sacrifice and compromises. So to me, everyone talks about self-care, which it's so overused, this term, right? So we do want to dive a little bit deeper here today and give you all some tangible examples that have helped me under this umbrella that is self-care. Everyone should do self-care, but it does look a little bit differently for everyone, or different for everyone, depending on your needs and your personality. To me, I'll start with some obvious ones, and then some that might seem counterintuitive at first. I started new hobbies, first of all. So Rumble is one of them. Trying something new, trying something where you're kind of not in your comfort zone, but just learning it and just feeling like you're growing a skill that you haven't, just really helped me get distracted and focus on that versus sitting at home and being miserable or dwelling over feeling lonely. So just working on yourself, finding something that is new to you. Another one,
not to cut you off too. I just want to like give you kudos for your Rumble experience, because I feel like you set a goal and you did it. You like kick butt and you built really good relationships, like friendships out of going to Rumble. You did that. And it was like so exciting because you're achieving this goal that is not just like, oh, I want to meet a partner. Like, yeah, that is also a part of your life. You want to meet a partner, but that no longer is like the big thing that you're working towards. And I feel like that really, at least that's my observations.
So on that note, I think one of the biggest takeaways I also learned recently, energy is not infinite, right? You have finite energy per day. And if you sit here, you can choose. Everything in life is a choice. You can choose here. You can choose to spend your energy on just being on the apps, or just being on Instagram, scrolling through people's profiles and dwelling on why don't I have anyone, or just swiping mindlessly. But I've always been a believer that the right thing will come when it's the right time, and you just putting almost like desperate energy into this, focusing too much on that outcome of that partner, I don't think it's going to serve us. So, and trust me, I've been there, I've been in that stage. So just like redirecting your energy and directing into yourself, and something that you'll never regret is the investment that you make in yourself. So the Rumble one is a perfect example. It's mentally just such a mood booster and stress reliever. I can be having a bad day and then just going to Rumble. So yeah, thank you for acknowledging that. Also shout out to my girl Paige, who I've grown a lot closer with now through Rumble, but so beautiful. And yeah, so long story short, for listeners, find something that you want to pour your energy into. The partner will come, but it doesn't behoove us to sit here and be so obsessive over that one person, because you have such little control over that. You have way more control into finding that hobby, killing it at it, and just getting better, finding a new community, and just meeting people through that.
A lot of times I feel like by taking on hobbies, or, you know, especially like more of a social hobby, you end up meeting people you never really would cross paths with, but it's just because you happen to have this thing outside of work, outside of your regular friend group.
And thank you for touching on that. This is not an episode just about singleness, right, and romantic relationships. It's also about friends and others. But yes, to your point, building community and the rest will follow, but really focusing on yourself. A few others that I do sometimes, like having a date night with yourself, just taking yourself out. It might seem uncomfortable. And I've had some conversations with people that met me and they were like, whoa, you're just out here like eating dinner by yourself. And it took me a while. Was that person me?
Was I the judgy person?
Exactly, right. Yeah, it took some time to get there. I started with hotel bars. It's honestly, for those of you that want to just try it out, go to a hotel bar. Why? Well, hotel bars are usually filled with people that are also traveling by themselves. Even though you're not traveling, it might be your city, right? But you're going to meet people that are usually on their own. They're traveling. I will guarantee you'll have interesting conversations, and it will make you feel more confident and more comfortable just being there by yourself. Sometimes I bring a book just as a backup, but in more cases than not, I end up engaging in a conversation with a complete stranger.
I think you're exactly right. Like doing something that kind of takes you away from this fear. I think for me, like this is something I clearly have been actively working on with my therapist. And she's been really challenging me to start small. Like to your point about going to a hotel bar. I know it's like a silly, but it's something small, like whatever it may be. For me, she's been challenging me to do that. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is like, I really enjoy watching movies. I really enjoy watching movies with people, but maybe that's like a place where I can start first. You know, the room is really dark. Nobody really can see anybody. Only you know that you're really there yourself, right? Nobody else really cares, frankly. But that's what I've been thinking. And Kyle's like, oh, well, maybe we could go to the theaters. I'll go watch my movie. You go watch whatever movie you want to watch. That way you're literally sitting there alone in this movie, but you know that, you know, there's somebody there if you feel uncomfortable, whatever. So I think just for me, little baby steps is the best way for me to kind of get out of that mental rut and start to work towards breaking that barrier. The other thing too, like I have started to try like going shopping by myself. Like I have also always thought shopping is a very social experience, but clearly not. Like most people shop by themselves is totally fine, but I'm going to try to work on that. I tried to do that the other day. I was very weirded out, but I bought some stuff. I went to a couple different stores, and again, nobody cared. So I think for me, it's just trying, making the stakes a little bit higher. And one of the things my therapist always asks me after I do whatever activity, she's always like, oh, so what was the consequence? Like, did people think you were a weirdo? Like, no, literally nobody cared. Nobody really saw, right? Like, who's out there looking for people who are just hanging out by themselves? Yeah. So I think just doing it repeatedly, then also reminding myself that there was literally no negative consequence coming out of this, and having that evidence, for me at least, is very, very helpful to get out of
Yeah,
therapy.
wow, that's great. I'm glad that therapist sounds like a good one. And it's funny how you and I are on such different journeys, but I had to cringe when you talked about shopping with people. I will never ever do that. I hate shopping with people. It's just so funny how we're very different in that regard.
I cannot. Oh my gosh. I walked into Uniqlo. I was so busy looking at other people. Nobody was looking at me, right? But like ugh, I was
Yeah,
just so
yeah.
concerned. Um, but going back
Sorry,
to
one more tip I just came to mind as we were
yeah.
speaking that I don't want to miss. It might sound counterintuitive, but for me, when I have that feeling of loneliness arise, going off social media really helps. And
Mm,
so it might seem weird, right? Why would I go off social media? But it's that whole point about when you're on social media, you're comparing your own reality with other people's highlight reels.
mhm.
And it's really draining. And I'm on social media, it just exacerbates that feeling of loneliness because I see, oh, this couple just got engaged, these people have babies, oh, this person just bought a house, and I just get more and more of that spiral and that emotional distress. So
Mhm.
taking a day off social media, highly recommend.
I want to talk a little bit, like going back to earlier, you were talking a little bit about relationship. I'm curious your perspective. How do you like balance being overly picky, right? And I'm using overly, but like overly picky sounds negative, but like being picky and having your standards
Mm-hmm.
versus being open-minded and like being with somebody who maybe doesn't fit all of your criteria, right? Because this is something I maybe want to challenge you to think about. So you talked about relationship. What's kind of your perspective around this?
Mm-hmm. And I think I learned a lot from you in this over the years. This is the $1 million question, right? Because no one is perfect. No relationship will ever be perfect. And you can have your standards, you can have your sort of non-negotiables, but then at the end of the day, you're just going to make it work with someone, right? You're never going to find that perfect person. Um, where I though now come a long way is that I gave my energy and my love to a lot of people that did not necessarily deserve it, or they didn't
Mm,
really want it. So my standards were quite low in the sense that people that were just maybe like good looking on paper, or like on paper they checked some
mhm,
boxes.
mhm.
Maybe they were really smart, or they were really successful, or hot, if you will, whatever.
Yeah.
But they were not actually emotionally available, or they weren't actually ready to meet me where I am. They didn't want the same things. They did not want a committed relationship. So I think
Mm,
to really find that person that you're going to make life work with, it takes more time. And especially in nowadays dating culture, it's so easy to have all these options, right? And just go to the if the conflict arises, just, well, there's all these other 10 matches I have, so let me
right.
just go to the next one. But I think just the line is really about what are some of your core values. For me, I want a person that is kind and compassionate. And it
Mhm.
sounds silly maybe, but I've dated people that were not necessarily that. Even though, but it took me a while. It took me a lot of like self-discovery to figure out what are some of the, how do I want that person to make me feel? That's another good question you should ask yourself. If that
Mm,
person is making you feel anxious and like roller coaster, butterfly, up and
mm,
down, which I've always had that, or I kind of like was drawn to that, that's probably not healthy in the long run. So
mm,
now I'm much more deliberate about saying no to when my body is telling me, hey, this might not be a good situation. You are getting some anxiety here, so maybe you should listen to that. And
mm,
therefore, I say no to the wrong people faster. Sure, I'm still single, but at the end of the day, I am making room and space for the person that's actually going to end up there in my
mhm.
in my world. What about you, Jen? Obviously, you're in a very happy marriage. Were there things you clearly had to make the decision, right? Like, do I go with Kyle
Yeah.
or do I stay single? How was that for you?
Well, you know this, but for our audience, I feel like it's cheesy because when I was single, I was also actively looking for a relationship, I guess. And every girlfriend that I had would tell me this really cheesy thing of, oh, love will come when it's the right time. And, you know, you'll least expect it. That's what they always say. You'll least expect it. And funny enough, I, at the time, thought it was very dumb. I was like, oh, I cannot believe they tell me that. Funny enough, that was kind of my experience, is when I least was looking for a serious relationship, I met Kyle. So, you know, timing couldn't have been more, you could say perfect, or maybe not perfect, I guess. But I think, to your point about like being picky and being holding true to like what's really important for you, the foundations, I 100% agree with it. Also agree with the fact that like there's just no perfect person, right? Like I'm not perfect, my partner is not perfect, and you go in, I think a lot of times, a lot of my single friends, and even I know I was guilty of this, have a list of things that are like they romanticize as like what they want in their partner. So I'll use myself as an example. When I was a little bit younger and I was, you know, dating, I thought on my checklist that like ambition is something that my partner must have. And at the time, the way I defined it is like, oh, my partner needs to be super competitive at work and be the best and outperform everybody and climb a corporate ladder and want to be somebody, right? And I met Kyle. Kyle's like a realist. Like he's not out there fighting in the corporate ladder, right? Like he is super successful and he is very ambitious, but he taught me the importance of like living life, and that your life doesn't revolve around climbing a corporate ladder. It is very important to work hard and to grow in your career and to like continue to challenge yourself, but that is different than the definition that I had. And he taught me a lot about the importance of like working so that you can go live your best life, to go travel and experience the world, and to learn about different cultures. And, you know, working hard enables that, but working hard doesn't, you know, the goal is not to climb a corporate ladder. And so I think there's a lot of things that I maybe thought were super, super important for me when I was initially dating, that now that I'm in a more longer and serious relationship, I realized weren't actually fundamental to what I needed in a partner. So I think, I mean, when I was thinking about this question, like when I tell people, who my single girlfriends, I'm like, well, really, you know, like challenge yourself and think about what is a truly non-negotiable, right? Like to your point, being kind and being respectful, like these are truly non-negotiables. I don't care what state you are in life, you need to be a certain type of person. But things like ambition or looks or what it looks like on resume, like some of the things you were talking about on resume, it's good, but I'm willing to let that go or have a different perspective on it, right? Yeah. So I think, yeah, that's kind of, there's no good answer to what are things you must have versus being open-minded about other things. But I think it's a line that everybody needs to kind of figure out for themselves based on the criteria that they believe are like what I must look for in a person.
That is something I think our audience, everyone can go through this exercise, right? Of my standards or my beliefs, what I really wanted as a non-negotiable might have changed, right? To really go a little bit deeper there. And to your point, as you reframed ambition and what that actually means, and how Kyle taught you that you can be ambitious but still live for life. I think that is so beautiful. I've definitely gone through that journey too. Like kind and compassionate were not on my list like years ago. It sounds silly, but it was more about superficial things. And now I like, to the core, I couldn't date someone that is not like, doesn't show some sort of compassion to people that may not look like them, or may not be as privileged as them, or whatever it may be. And just so anyway,
I'll add too, like I hope that people don't feel like, oh, I must give up something, you know, like I think maybe going back to the example of ambition, like what I learned is there's different definitions and like different ways that this characteristic manifests, right? Like when I think about it, it's not just the black and white, like, oh, are you ambitious or not? Is why are you ambitious, right? For me, when I initially was looking for somebody, I thought ambition means that he's, competitive. He wants to be the best. He is the best. And he, wants to go be somebody. But then when I met Kyle, I realized his ambition manifests in a different way, right? He works hard so that he could go live life to the fullest. He works hard so he can create a very stable life for us, right? Like it doesn't mean he's not ambitious. So I think like ultimately it's when we say like, oh, this person checks a box, it's not really this yes or no black and white thing. Are you okay with the way they, execute or manifest on this particular characteristic or feature that you're looking for?
Okay. Why don't we pivot slightly here? We talked a lot about loneliness in terms of romantic relationships, but loneliness can also manifest itself in friendships or disconnect with family. I think what the underlying thread in all of this is you choose yourself over maybe a friendship, over a relationship that you could have, or over a family member that you may not agree with, right? So I think overall, just being okay with being alone requires a lot of confidence. So confidence is really that key factor, and setting boundaries. So saying no and not being worried about hurting people's feelings intentionally, right? So being okay with potentially leaving people behind, whether that is that situationship that didn't serve you or that friendship that may have run its course. And to give you a specific example, as I reflected on this question, in 2020, that was obviously a big year for many of us. And with the murder of George Floyd, it really kicked off my personal allyship journey. I wish I could say I always aspired to be an ally. 2020 was definitely that turning point. And in my friend group, we've had to have some very tough conversations and some very uncomfortable conversations. Me talking to my Black friends and getting called out and getting corrected, it's something that I wasn't really used to, right? And you have to just a lot of learning, a lot of like taking the ego out of it, being open, being humble. So in any case, as I was using and trying to infuse my learnings into the conversation with my white friends, not everyone is in the same allyship journey, right? So that's one thing. But then understanding that some of the people in my group may not ever want to understand. They just refuse that the Black experience in this country is different than the white experience. And if you don't understand that fundamentally, then there is a problem. I cannot really be in your friend group. There's got to be some common understanding that white and Black have different experiences. We have different privilege, and we are entitled. White people are entitled to different things than Black people. So the BLM movement. So if for people that don't support BLM, whether I met some people on dating apps that didn't understand what was that about, swipe left, and then just with my friends, fundamental aspects surrounding human rights. And that there was a point where I just couldn't overlook that, or I couldn't look past that anymore. And I had to separate myself from some people that I used to call friends, which is, you would think, wow, that's crazy, right? And I'm not just saying, if we talk about cancel culture a lot, I feel like everyone can be forgiven if they take accountability and actually willing to learn. But in that moment, they were not willing to learn. They were not willing to be open. They were not willing to even hear a different perspective. And so for me, that just resulted in either me still having this friendship and going against my values, or standing up for myself, for the Black community, for my dear friends that I want to be an ally for. So again, it was this choosing myself and being alone over having the friendship. So hopefully that explains that it can really also happen in like a friendship scenario.
I 100% agree. I think you touched on a really good point of like, do my friends, or are my friends willing to learn about something, right? Or to, even if they don't experience it, because there are some things some people are just never going to experience. I mean, we even talked about this earlier in this podcast, right? I have an Asian American experience that my husband's never going to have, but he's open to learning about it, to hearing about it, and to be sympathetic or empathetic about it. And I think a lot of times, like your example is a very clear example of some people are not open or not at that stage maybe in their journey, and you're just fundamentally at a very different place. And I think the tough part is like, you could have friends who are not very educated about something, but right, so you're not at the same place in this journey, but if they are open to learning and listening and hearing about it and willing to try something different in their behavior, action, whatever it may be, like the effort in and of itself is worth investing your time in that relationship. To your point, like fundamentally, we shouldn't give up on what we believe in. And I don't know, it's hard because you also want to be accepting, right? Like of other people's situations, but I don't know.
That's
I don't think there's a
where's
clear
the line, right? And I really don't want to, like, I want to be really clear. This is not just about politics, like you vote Republican, I vote Democrat, but I think 2020 really highlighted this is way more about fundamentally human rights, right? And about how can all of us have the same rights at the end of the day, which we're far from still, but there's just something, if it doesn't align with your values, don't feel like you have to put your values second, just so that you can have or to keep whatever friend around. And to Jane's point, it's all about, are they willing to learn? Are they willing to be open to hear your perspective? I'm always up for good discussion.
If this person is not open to being called out or to reflect on it when they after they get called out or change their behavior, then it's like, it is not my job to change you. You are who you are, and if you're willing to change, great. If you're not willing, then it's not my job. So I think, sometimes it's tough and it's really sad because a lot of times, like, nobody wants to lose a friend, and it's always really sad. But at the end of the day, like, my mom taught me this. She said, some people are just meant to be in your life for a short period of time, and it was a great time, but if they're not meant to be, they're not meant to be. You will have friends that you will have for forever because fundamentally you just align. And some people are just there for a good time.
No, it's very true. That goes in friendships, relationships, all the things. But they all serve a purpose at some point.
Right. Oh, well, this has been quite the discussion. I feel like we've touched on so many different topics. We didn't even get to talk too much about family. I feel like we've just like barely scratched the surface. So who knows, maybe in our next season, we will bring this topic back and we'll talk more about like deep dive into one particular component. But we want to hear from you all, from our audience. What's been your experience being alone versus lonely? What has been some of your loneliest days, and were you alone at that time? We would love to hear from you. Also, anybody who is actively navigating this, we want to know what type of tips and what's working for you. Share that with us at our email at where's the line pod@gmail.com. And of course, we want to have you in our journey as we continue this season. So make sure to subscribe. We are on Apple, Spotify, and Google Podcast. Thanks for joining us today.